said that I've known him since he was a boy preacher. I'm not that much older than him. But I want to say publicly what I've said privately, how much I appreciate his friendship and the fellowship. We've had such a great time here in Albuquerque these last 2 days. Reverend Davis, he, Pastor Member, let me beat them at golf. Pastor Member did it twice. and to all of these other preachers and pastors that are here, you're an acquaintance with Pastor Walker, to President Bagnell, and all the other preachers, Pastor Smith, everyone else that's here, and of course, to not all the preachers who come. And it's always good to have someone come and be in your amen section. I think all of Mount Olive came, and they did kill us with song, amen? Amen. Austin Fire, Travel, and all the other members of the Mount Olive Church that are here. God bless you all. They have to go back home. Stay. I might just stay. So I missed my flight in the morning. The other ones are full, so that means I can't come back to Tuesday or Wednesday. Amen. There's a word for us in the 34th number of the Psalm. David writes, Psalm 34, I'm going to read those first 4 verses from the New King James Version. David says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. Then he says, oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. I want to talk about on this afternoon a survivor's story. A survivor's story. This Psalm of David is usually considered to have been written after David escaped from the Philistines at Gath. The story is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 21 and chapter 2. David is on the run because Saul has put a hit on David's life. You recall that Saul had become jealous of David because the people rejoiced over David. In a crisis situation, David stepped in and saved the day. You remember the armies of Israel were being taunted by Goliath, and they were afraid to face him. And David comes along and shows strong faith in God that had previously given him success with lions and bears. And so he had no fear of this uncircumcised Philistine. We all know the story. David kills Goliath with a sling and a stone, and Saul is initially pleased with David and gives to David his daughter's hand in marriage. But things changed. For the people put David on a pedestal. The Bible says that the women would sing, Saul had slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And now Saul is salty. He wants David dead. So David finds himself running for his life from Saul because Saul has lost favor and David gained it. On the run, David has to be concerned about Saul and the enemies of Israel. He's in between a rock and a hard place. The odds are stacked against him, but what David discovers is that God is able to handle whatever situation we find ourselves in. And because God handles it, David becomes a survivor, and he writes this song about his ordeal. And I thought I would preach this on this afternoon for this church anniversary celebration, because whenever a church is able to stick around and celebrate her struggles and successes, it's a collective and congregate survivor story. But then I also know that there's some individual survivors that are in the place tonight to hear that have their own private and personal survivor stories. I may not know the details, but I can guess that as you went through your ordeal, even if you didn't lose faith, others did. There's some people here that have gone through some things and survived what they were not supposed to make it through. The odds were stacked against you. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't have a story to tell. What you were up against should have taken you out, but you're still here and you're still standing. I'm talking to somebody this afternoon that was a victim, but now you are a victor. I'm telling somebody's story. The doctor said it was cancer. The second opinion confirmed the first one, and they gave you a life expectancy based on what others that were in the same condition went through. But that was then, and this is now, and you're still here with a story to tell about how God brought you through. That's not you, okay? How about this one? You thought you were in love, so you let it move in. And after a while, what you thought was going to be your happy home became a haunted house. You had to endure verbal abuse, physical abuse. Your life started to look like a Lifetime Network movie. You didn't know how you would make it by yourself, so you endured indignity and abuse. But one day you found a strength that you didn't know that you had, and you were able to get away. You and your children, and now you have your testimony. You have a survival story of how God delivered you from me. That's still not you. Okay. How about this one? You were young and dumb, and you made some mistakes, bad choices and bad things. You became a statistic in the system. It was hard for you to do anything with a record, but instead of continuing to be victimized by your past, you decided to embrace your future, and you discovered that it doesn't matter what people say about you. It doesn't matter what you used to do, because now you can do all things through Christ that strengthens you. And the same people that used to point at you in the region now have to point at you as a picture of success. When you're trusting God, you got a survivor's story. Because all of us will inevitably have to go through stresses and struggles and hard times and heartaches every now and then. We need to hear the testimony of someone that has been tested. We need to hear from someone that has been through the storm and has seen some trouble. We need to hear from someone who has a survivor story so they can tell us how they got over it. We need to hear every now and then how the Lord brought them out. Because it's encouraging for people who are in the storm to know that there's shelter from the storm. We need encouragement because our minds will play tricks on us. Because we're often conflicted between our faith in God and the reality of what we see. Listen, if you're honest with yourself, you'll have to admit that sometimes, even when you know God can, you still have doubts because you don't think that God will. Am I in the house here? And we think that way because the logic of every situation is that why does God allow us to get in a mess if he's going to bring us out of the mess? So we begin to believe that all of our troubles and trials are because God is punishing us. But what you got to remember is that the wages of sin is death, not trouble. I wish I had a witness here. Ultimately, all of our problems are caused by sin, but it's not always your fault. It's not always your fault that you have cancer. It isn't your fault that someone abused you. When you're in trouble, it's not always because of something that you did. And the situation that you're in, and the situation that God is willing and able to bring you out of is not necessarily your fault. Here it is. Adam messed it up for all of us. We are under a curse, but the good news of the gospel is just like Adam messed it up for all of us, Jesus can fix it for all of us. So this afternoon, as we reminisce on where we used to be, and we think about how far God has brought us from, as we rehearse in our minds our own survival stories, we we want to look at this text. We want to revisit David's story to see the similarity between David's story and your story and my story. First of all, this text indicates to us that the story of a survivor is a story of prayer. It's there, verse 4. David says that he sought the Lord. That David knew from experience that God is not elusive in or out of trials. God is always near. And we know that as well. But what David indicates in verse 4 is that God's deliverance, God's help is always just a prayer away. The Bible in 2 Chronicles 15:2 says that if we seek the Lord, he will be found by us. But not only will God be found, but Jesus says that we will get what we need and what we want when we ask God for it. Matthew 7:7 says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and it will be open to you. One of the things that we got to learn to do in the middle of our situation is seek the Lord. One of the ways we mess up things is that we often try to do what makes sense to us. But in my own story, I found out that sometimes what God is doing and how God is doing doesn't make sense. God doesn't have to be logical. God doesn't have to follow a pattern. God is not limited to the algorithms and theories of probability that everything else is governed by. But we often try to use logic and common sense to solve issues that are illogical and uncommon. I tell somebody, quit trying to devise a plan and rely on the divine plan. The writer of Proverbs says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, and all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. What I'm telling somebody is don't worry about it, pray about it. But don't plot around it, pray about it. Jesus says that you ought to always pray and never give up. Somebody needs to know that the prologue, the preamble, and the prerequisite to your survival story is prayer. It happens when we pray. This thing is that prayer does some things for us that they can't happen through any other medium. Prayer puts us in the presence of God. In prayer, God invites us in, and then he envelops us within his presence. And God's presence gives us peace that surpasses all understanding. So that in between our dilemma and our deliverance, we don't have to fall apart. We don't have to climb the walls and pace the floor. We can be content to wait until our change comes because we're confident in how the story ends. David says, he says, I sought the Lord and he answered me. I wish I had a witness here. Prayer is never a one-way monologue. What prayer is a dialogue. We don't just say a prayer. We have conversations with God. Here's something to shout about. God has promised us that in prayer, when we talk, he'll listen. We have access through prayer. We're never put on the waiting list. We never get put on hold. We're never turned away. We have access 24/7, 365 days a year. Prayer allows us to have conversation and communion with God. It's through prayer that we're with God, and God is with us. And in prayer, we are ushered into the throne room of God. The writer of Hebrews says that we can come boldly to the throne of grace to obtain mercy in our time of need. The throne represents the sovereign holiness of God. It's the holiness of God that we get our help from. See, our survival story is predicated by prayer and the holiness of God, in that God moves on our behalf because we've experienced the presence of his holiness. And he does some things for us because of his name. See, God obligates himself on our behalf because the promises he made about prayer. I wish I had a witness here. Listen, it's not because you're a prayer warrior. It's not because your knees are all stuffed up. It's because God has promised to hear and answer prayer. David in this psalm, he doesn't indicate exactly what it was that he sought the Lord about or how God answered, but we can speculate based on two things. One, we know that David was on the run from multiple enemies. And secondly, we see in the psalm that David praises God for his deliverance. So we can deduct that David sought the Lord from his enemies, and that God answered David's prayer by delivering him from the enemies that he prayed for deliverance for. See, what you need to do is ask God for what you need in your survival story. Listen, whatever it is you need, you got to know that God can. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Prayer changes things. Through prayer, God can do what you thought couldn't be done. Is there anybody here that knows that God will answer prayer? Is there anybody here that you didn't even think that you would make it, but God answered your prayer? I can tell you for myself that God will answer prayer. I want you to know that Jesus is on the main line. You can tell him what you want. David's survival story is a story of prayer. But secondly, the story of a survivor is a story of protection. I'm in verse 4 still. David says that the Lord delivered him from his fears. Well, what is David afraid of? Well, David has multiple fears. David is in that unenviable position where if it's not one thing, it's another. Yeah, on the one hand, Saul is out to get David because David has the favor of God. You know, it's an odd thing that often when God favors you, sometimes your former friends can become fatalistic foes. People who had no problem with you when you were down and out sometimes get all funny acting when your status changes. Saul is upset with David and jealous of David because David has the blessing of God and the praise of the people. But on the other hand, it was the praise of the people that has David fearing as well. You remember the people saying the praises of David, saying that Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain 10,000. David was famous for killing a life. And while that was a good thing in Israel, it was detrimental in Philistine territory. David has a lot to be afraid of. And fear is a strange and perplexing emotion. It manifests itself in different ways to different people. And so you can never tell what will cause fear in an individual or what that person's particular response will be. But one thing is certain is that no one has a monopoly on fear. And no one is immune from fear. Fear can be a dangerous and devastating dilemma in the life of anyone. Fear is an intimidator. It causes you to worry and fret and be anxious. It robs you of confidence and faith. You remember in Matthew 8:26, the disciples were caught in the storm. Jesus asked, why are you afraid? They were intimidated by the storm. Now, the truth and the reality of the situation that Jesus was literally and physically with them. He was in the boat. But because fear intimidates, because fear causes worry, because fear causes anxiety, and because fear feeds on itself and grows, the disciples' fear became greater than their faith. And so fear of what could happen is often worse than the reality of it happening. But the good news for David is that God is the deliverer. And he delivers us even from fear. In the text, when David is delivered from all of his fears, he's also delivered from his enemies, the source of those fears. But what David discovers is what he'll write about in the 23rd Psalm, that if you are a child of God, no matter what the situation is, even in the valley of the shadow of death, we don't have to fear, because we can be confident in the fact that God is with us, and God is for us, and God will protect us and deliver us. I'm talking to somebody that's scared right now. You've already prayed about it, but God's not moving quickly enough for you, and you're still on the run, at least in your mind, because your situation doesn't seem to have changed. You see, the problem that you took to the Lord is still the problem. The mountain has not moved. The obstacle has not yet been sent to oblivion, but don't give up. I tell somebody, sharpen your pencils and get some extra pens and plenty of paper and get ready to write. Writers learn in the understanding of plot development that a good story has to have some complication. Without complication, complication. There is no climax and no need for resolution. I'm telling you that what you're going through, your complication is the material for your own survival story. What you got to understand is that trials and troubles, the stuff that we go through that frighten us, are often just a prelude to our praise. Paul says that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. Jesus promised us protection when he says that in this world we will have tribulations, but be of good cheer because I've overcome the world. Our survival story, though, is not just about when we all get to heaven. See, there will come a time when our souls will look back and wonder of how we got over. But I'm telling you, I don't have to wait until I get to heaven to shout about what God has done for me. See, my survival story is told on earth. I have a testimony right now. God has already brought me out of some pain. God has already blessed me in spite of me. God has already made some enemies me. I'm still here. You gotta tell your story before you get over. In the Bible, Daniel was still there when he told about his experience in the lion's den. He had a testimony after his trouble because God protected him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were still there after the fiery furnace. They had a survival story because God protected them. That's what David is indicating to us in this psalm, that the survival story is authored in heaven, but it's written on earth. It was the same David in Psalm 27 says that I would have fainted unless I believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Psalm 124, David says that if it had not been for the Lord on my side, that's a survival story. David was familiar with being in situations that only God could bring him out of. Anybody been there? Been in some stuff that you couldn't get out. You weren't smart enough, didn't have enough money, didn't know the right people. Only God could have brought you out. That's a survivor's story. And there was Marvin Sapp who came up with the modern survivor's anthem. He says, I never would have made it. Never could have made it without the Lord. I would have lost it all. But now I see that God was there for me. And now I'm strong. I'm wiser. I'm better. That's a survivor story. So somebody needs to know that even though it may look bleak right now, God is still protecting you. Don't give up. Don't give in. Get in the mirror and practice your testimony. Start going over it in your mind about how you thank God for bringing you out of it. While you're still in the valley, go ahead. Prepare for victory. Make a rough draft. Outline your survivor story. Remember, the survivor story is a story of prayer. It's a story of protection. But finally, I want to tell you that the story of a survivor is a story of praise. David makes praise a priority. Even before he tells us about his prayer and protection, he invites us in the text to praise God with him. And in verse 1, he says that he will bless the Lord at all times. That the praise of the Lord shall continually be in his mouth. What David is saying is that he appreciated what God has done. And he appreciated what God is doing and what God has promised to do. See, a lot of people still think that you ought to wait until you have the victory before you do the victory.